Listen closely, because this isn't about tricks, games, or controlling another human being, even if the title sounds extreme on purpose. This is about something far deeper, something quieter, something that hits an avoidant at the level they never learned how to protect. Most people think avoidants are strong because they walk away so easily, because they shut down without warning, because they can detach like flipping a switch. But that's just the armor. What you're about to hear is about what happens when that armor stops working, when the very thing they rely on to stay safe suddenly turns against them. And when that happens, the emotional collapse isn't loud, it's internal, it's slow, and it's devastating. If you've ever loved an avoidant, if you've ever felt discarded, confused, or replaced, like you were nothing, stay with me, because this will reframe everything you thought you knew about power, love, and why walking away without drama does more damage than any confrontation ever could. The moment you stop trying to be understood by an avoidant is the moment they start losing control, and control, not love, is what they've been protecting their entire life. Here's the part no one tells you. Avoidants are not afraid of losing people. They are afraid of losing leverage from the outside. It looks like abandonment doesn't bother them, like distance is their comfort zone, like separation is easy. But internally, the real fear is much darker. It's the fear of not being the one who decides, the fear of not being the one who pulls away first, the fear of realizing that someone else no longer needs access to them in order to feel whole. When you chase, explain, plead, or wait, you unknowingly feed their sense of safety. You reassure them that they are still at the center of emotional gravity, that no matter how cold they become, you'll stay warm for both of you. And that's exactly why nothing changes. But when you stop doing that one thing, when you stop orienting your emotional world around their availability, something inside them begins to fracture. Not because they miss you in the romantic way movies talk about, but because the power dynamic they depend on quietly collapses. Most people believe the biggest mistake with an avoidant is leaving too soon or giving up too easily. That's a lie that keeps people stuck for years. The real mistake is staying emotionally accessible when the avoidant has already checked out. Loyalty, patience, and unconditional understanding feel noble, but to an avoidant nervous system, they signal something else entirely. They signal that you can be paused, that you'll still be there later, that there is no urgency, and avoidants only move when urgency threatens their sense of control. This is why explaining your pain doesn't work. This is why asking for clarity backfires. This is why trying to prove your value only pushes them further away. You are playing a game they already know how to win. But when you step out of the game entirely, not dramatically, not angrily, not with ultimatums, but with calm finality, the avoidant mind does something it rarely does. It turns inward, and when it turns inward, it doesn't find peace. It finds panic. The thing that eventually makes an avoidant fall apart is not being punished, confronted, or abandoned in the obvious way. It's irreversibility. Avoidants can tolerate distance. They can tolerate silence. They can tolerate breakups. What they cannot tolerate is the feeling that access to you is permanently closed, not because you're hurt, not because you're waiting for them to come back, but because you genuinely no longer need them to regulate your emotional state. The moment they sense that your withdrawal isn't a tactic, that it isn't temporary, that it isn't designed to provoke a reaction, something deep inside them starts screaming. Because now they are no longer choosing distance. Distance has chosen them, and that flips the script in a way their nervous system was never trained to handle. This is usually when the watching begins. Quietly, secretly, they start paying attention in ways they never did before. They notice your absence more than your presence. They replay old moments, not to feel love, but to regain orientation. They try to understand when the balance shifted, when they stopped being the one with emotional gravity. And here's the part that feels almost cruel in its irony. The calmer you become, the less reactive you are, the more grounded your energy feels, the more destabilized they become internally, because avoidants are wired to manage chaos by withdrawing. But what do you do when there is no chaos to withdraw from? What do you do when the person you expected to be broken is suddenly whole without you? That's when the internal collapse begins. Slowly, invisibly, but relentlessly. Silence, when it's grounded, is louder than any argument. Detachment, when it's genuine, is more powerful than any demand. You don't have to announce your departure. You don't have to explain your growth. You don't have to make them understand. In fact, the need to be understood is often the last chain that keeps you emotionally tied to them. When that chain breaks, the avoidant loses the upper hand without you ever lifting a finger. They can't argue with your peace. They can't debate your self-respect. They can't deactivate their way out of a reality where they are no longer needed to feel significant. And significance is the one thing their independence was secretly built to protect. Inside an avoidant is a constant war they never talk about. One part of them wants closeness, reassurance, and connection. Another part associates those very things with suffocation, obligation, and loss of self. When you chase, you activate the second part, the part that runs. But when you stop chasing and start living, when your energy shifts from seeking validation to embodying wholeness, you activate both parts at once. And that creates unbearable tension. They want to move toward you, but they can't, because doing so would mean admitting they need you. They want to pull away, but they can't, because you've already emotionally left. This is where the obsession quietly forms. Not obsession with you as a person, but obsession with the loss of control over the dynamic that once made them feel safe. This is also when memory starts to distort. They remember you differently now, not as the person who wanted too much, but as the person who stopped needing anything. They replay conversations searching for signs they missed. They romanticize moments they once dismissed. They feel jealousy without knowing why, curiosity without permission, a strange pull they can't rationalize. And because avoidants rely on logic to suppress emotion, this lack of clarity unsettles them deeply. They can't categorize you anymore. You're no longer the secure base they could leave and return to at will. You're a closed door, and closed doors haunt avoidance far more than open ones. Here's where the misunderstanding often happens. From the outside, it can look like you've gained control over them. Like they've become smaller, while you've become bigger. Like they're now orbiting you emotionally. But the truth is more sobering and more empowering. At the same time, you didn't dominate them. You didn't manipulate them. You didn't turn them into anything. You simply removed yourself from a dynamic that required you to self-abandon. And without your participation, the avoidance strategy collapses. What feels like them falling is really them confronting a void. They've spent their entire life avoiding. A void where they are no longer in charge of distance. A void where someone they assumed would always be emotionally available has chosen themselves instead. This is why the shift is so dangerous and so powerful at the same time. Dangerous? Because if you go back too soon, if you mistake their confusion for change, if you re-enter the dynamic without boundaries, everything reset. Powerful. Because if you stay grounded, if you don't flinch, if you let your silence be final rather than performative, the avoidant is forced to feel something they've numbed for decades: powerlessness. And powerlessness is the one emotion their nervous system doesn't know how to escape from. So if you're listening to this and wondering whether walking away calmly really does more than explaining yourself one last time, understand this. Avoidants don't break when you leave. They break when they realize you left without them being the reason you can't survive. They don't fall because you pulled them down. They fall because you stood up. And once that realization settles in, once they understand that you are no longer emotionally negotiable, something fundamental shifts inside them. Not because they want to submit, not because they want to serve, but because for the first time, they are no longer the one holding the leash. And losing that control feels to them like losing everything. And this is where most people mess it up without even realizing it. The moment they sense the avoidant shifting, watching, circling emotionally, curiosity returning, they break their own momentum. They explain, they soften, they reach out just a little, and instantly, the spell breaks because the power you gained was never about distance itself. It was about certainty. The certainty that you are no longer emotionally available on demand. Pulling away works not because it hurts them, but because it removes their ability to regulate themselves through you. Confrontation invites debate. Violence ends negotiation. When you stop trying to make them understand, you force them to feel, and avoidants are far more threatened by feelings than by words. An avoidant can argue forever. They can intellectualize pain, reframe memories, justify distance, but they cannot argue with a reality where you no longer revolve around them. They cannot deactivate a nervous system response triggered by loss of control when you remain calm, grounded, and consistent in your absence. Their system starts scrambling. This isn't the dramatic panic people imagine. It's quieter. They check their phone more. They replay interactions. They start wondering what you're doing. Not because they miss you, but because uncertainty has entered their emotional environment. And uncertainty is the one thing they never learned how to self-soothe. You didn't provoke them. You didn't threaten them. You simply removed the emotional supply they unconsciously depended on. Inside their mind, something strange starts happening. The narrative flips. Before you were predictable. You were the one who stayed, who waited, who tried. Now you're undefined. And the avoidant mind hates undefined states. It needs labels, roles, and distance. It can measure when you stop reacting, stop chasing, stop explaining. You become emotionally opaque, and opacity triggers obsession, not because they want closeness, but because they need orientation. They need to know where they stand, and for the first time, they don't. That loss of footing creates internal pressure, the kind that builds slowly and cracks quietly. This is when the internal conflict becomes unbearable. One part of them wants to reach out, test the waters, see if access still exists. Another part is terrified that reaching out will expose need, and need feels like weakness. So they do nothing, and that nothing eats at them. They scroll, they stalk, they imagine conversations that never happen. They rehearse casual messages they never send. And every day you remain grounded. Every day you don't flinch. That tension grows. You're no longer someone they can leave and return to whenever they want. You've become a question mark, and avoidants don't handle unanswered questions well. Eventually, something shifts. Not outwardly at first, but internally. The avoidant realizes they no longer have the upper hand. They no longer decide the pace. They no longer control the emotional temperature. And this is the moment where the psychological reversal completes itself. Power was never about dominance. It was about who needed who more. And suddenly the equation has changed. You are no longer emotionally waiting. You are no longer hoping. You are no longer paused. And that realization hits them like a delayed impact. They start to feel smaller, not because you did anything to them, but because the dynamic that made them feel large no longer exists. This is also where memory begins to betray them. They replay moments differently now. Things they once minimized start to glow. Your presence feels heavier in retrospect because it's no longer accessible. And the brain, desperate to restore balance, begins rewriting the past. They remember your warmth more clearly. Your consistency feels rare now. Your absence becomes louder than your presence ever was. And this is where people confuse what's happening. I think the avoidant has suddenly fallen in love. But what's really happening is that the avoidant has lost their emotional anchor. And without it, they drift. Not toward intimacy, but toward fixation. Here's the critical reframe you need to hear. This isn't about making someone submit. It's about reclaiming yourself so fully that the other person no longer gets to define your emotional state. True power doesn't look like control. It looks like indifference to outcomes. you once obsessed over. It looks like calm where there used to be anxiety. And that calm is terrifying to someone who learned early on that connection equals danger. When you stop needing reassurance, you stop feeding the avoidance sense of superiority, and without that contrast, they are forced to confront their own emptiness. The behavior that causes the deepest internal spiral isn't coldness or cruelty, it's consistency without attachment. You show up in your life the same way every day. You don't punish, you don't provoke, you don't send mixed signals. You simply live as someone who no longer organizes their emotions around another person's availability. And this stability destabilizes them more than any dramatic exit ever could, because drama confirms importance. Calm detachment suggests replacement, and replacement, even imagined, strikes at the core of their fear. Not fear of losing you, but fear of being irrelevant. This is when a new fear emerges inside them, one they rarely acknowledge: permanence. Avoidants are comfortable with temporary distance. They assume doors remain unlocked, but when they sense that the door might be closed for good, their nervous system reacts violently, not outwardly, but internally. Sleep disturbances, sudden nostalgia, random waves of sadness. They tell themselves they're fine, that it doesn't matter, that they didn't want it anyway. But the body knows better. The body knows when access has been revoked, and it panics quietly. And here's the invisible line most people never see, the one the avoidant crosses too late. It's the moment they realize you're no longer emotionally negotiable, that they can't come back with half effort, that your silence isn't a pause, it's a decision. And once that line is crossed, they can't unsee it. They may still hesitate, they may still avoid, but something fundamental has shifted. You are no longer an option, you are a loss. And avoidants process loss very differently than others. They don't grieve loudly, they internalize it, they carry it. They replay it in fragments. If they sense that you've become replaceable to yourself, that your life is full, grounded, and moving forward, another reaction kicks in: jealousy without a target, curiosity without permission, a sudden urge to reassert relevance. This is where they might resurface, casually, indirectly, as if nothing happened. And this is the most dangerous moment for you, because this is where many people fold. They interpret the reappearance as growth, as regret, as awakening. But often, it's not about reconciliation. It's about restoring control. They don't want closeness yet. They want confirmation that the door still opens if they knock. And if you open it too easily, everything resets. The anxiety returns. The imbalance reestablishes itself. And you lose the very ground you fought so hard to reclaim. This is why staying grounded matters more than staying distant. You don't need to reject. You don't need to punish. You need to remain aligned with the version of yourself that no longer begs for clarity. That version is the one that shifted the dynamic. That version is the one they felt slipping away. And that version is the one that quietly dismantled the illusion of control they lived inside. Because in the end, what they're reacting to isn't you. It's the loss of the role you played in their emotional regulation. You were the stable background they could step away from, the constant they could ignore. When that constant disappears, the entire structure shakes. And that's when the avoidant truly begins to fall. Not at your feet, not into your arms, but into themselves, into feelings they never learned how to hold, into questions they can't answer, into a realization they can't escape, that the person they assumed would always be there chose themselves instead. And when they fall into themselves like that, when the noise finally dies down and there's no distraction left, something uncomfortable starts to surface. Not love, not longing, but a deep, gnawing awareness that they were never as independent as they believed. What they called strength was actually distance. What they called freedom was actually avoidance. And now that the person who quietly anchored their emotional world is no longer available, they feel exposed in a way they don't have language for. This is when the spiral deepens because they can no longer blame you. You didn't attack. You didn't beg. You didn't chase. You simply stopped participating. And that absence forces them to confront themselves, something they've been running from their entire life. This is where the avoidance internal system really starts to unravel. They begin to feel emotions out of sequence, regret mixed with relief, curiosity tangled with resentment, desire fighting fear. They tell themselves they're better off, that this is what they wanted, that distance is peace. But their body doesn't cooperate. Their chest feels heavier. Their thoughts loop. They feel pulled toward you and repelled at the same time. And that contradiction creates stress, real stress, the kind that seeps into their sleep, their focus, their mood. They start questioning things they've never questioned before. Why did that person stop caring so quietly? Why didn't they fight? Why didn't they need me? And that question cuts deeper than they expect, because avoidants often derive a hidden sense of worth from being needed, not wanted, needed. It reassures them that even if intimacy feels dangerous, they still matter. When that need disappears, so does the proof. And suddenly, they're faced with the terrifying possibility that you didn't just walk away because you were hurt. You walked away because you outgrew the dynamic. And that realization feels like rejection at the core level. Not rejection of who they are, but rejection of the role they played in your emotional life. And roles are safer than authenticity for avoidance. When the role dissolves, so does their sense of stability. This is when they begin to feel replaceable, not necessarily because there is someone else, but because there could be, and that potential alone is enough to trigger deep insecurity. Avoidants don't fear competition in the usual way. They fear being unnecessary. They fear becoming optional. They fear discovering that the person who once waited now has choices. And when that fear surfaces, it threatens their entire identity. Because if you can be okay without them, then maybe they weren't as essential as they thought, and that thought is unbearable. So they start looking for signs. Any signs. They scan social spaces, mutual connections, imagined scenarios. They try to measure whether you've moved on emotionally, and every sign of your stability, every hint of your growth, every indication that your life continues without disruption feels like a quiet blow. Not because they want to be with you, but because they want to matter. And the more self-contained you appear, the more invisible they feel. That invisibility triggers a primal fear, one that dates back to early experiences of emotional neglect or inconsistent care. The fear of being unseen, the fear of being irrelevant, the fear of not leaving a mark. This is why their reaction often looks delayed. Weeks or months can pass with no outward sign. People assume they've moved on easily, but internally, the process is slow and corrosive. They replay interactions, not to reconnect emotionally, but to regain a sense of importance. They ask themselves questions they never allowed before. Did I underestimate them? Did I push too far? Did I assume too much? And those questions erode their certainty. Avoidants survive by certainty. Certainty that they can leave. Certainty that they can come back. Certainty that the other person will still be there. When that certainty collapses, anxiety takes its place. And here's the paradox that traps them. The more they feel this anxiety, the more they want to reach out. But the more they consider reaching out, the more they fear exposing vulnerability. They don't know how to approach without losing face. They don't know how to admit curiosity without admitting need. And need feels dangerous. So they wait, they stall, they hover emotionally at a distance. And that waiting only intensifies the pressure inside them, because time doesn't heal this wound. Time confirms it. Every day that passes without your emotional availability reinforces the idea that something permanent has changed. This is also where many avoidants begin rewriting their self-image. They tell themselves stories to cope, that you were too much, that the timing was wrong, that it wouldn't have worked anyway. These stories aren't lies meant to hurt you. They're defenses meant to protect themselves from the pain of loss. But those defenses are fragile. They crack the moment they imagine you thriving, because thriving contradicts the narrative. Thriving means you didn't collapse without them. Thriving means you didn't need them to survive. And that realization destabilizes the belief that distance equals safety. What's happening now is subtle but profound. The avoidant is losing control, not over you, but over the story they tell themselves about who they are. They've always seen themselves as the one who leaves, the one who detaches, the one who doesn't need anyone. But now they're the one left behind emotionally. They're the one wondering. They're the one waiting for signs. And that role reversal is deeply unsettling because it exposes a truth they've avoided for years, that their independence was conditional. It depended on someone else staying emotionally available in the background. This is where the internal collapse reaches its deepest point. They feel powerless, not in a dramatic way, but in a quiet, persistent way. They realize they can't control your emotional state anymore. They can't trigger a reaction. They can't provoke reassurance. They can't reestablish the old dynamic. And that powerlessness is unfamiliar territory. They've spent their entire life avoiding it. They learned early on that being dependent meant being hurt. So they built a system that kept them in control. But now that system has failed and they're left with feelings they don't know how to process. This is why their behavior can become inconsistent at this stage. Hot one moment, cold the next. Curious but distant, present but unavailable. They're testing the edges of the new reality. They want to see if the door is truly closed. They want to see if you'll flinch, if you'll soften, if you'll revert. And every time you don't, every time you remain steady, calm, and self-directed,